wasn't the case. So I have no idea if this is going out to the world, if it's being broadcast correctly or not. I'm just live streaming, and hopefully it'll happen. It'll happen correctly or whatever. I'm doing really poorly at this live stream thing. Okay, so was Nirvana a grunge band? Yes, they were an alternative rock band, and alternative rock was made up of several genres of music, one of which was of course, grunge. And while I will admit that Nirvana had one foot squarely planted in the grunge world, they had their other foot so far out of the grunge world that at one time I would have argued with you that Nirvana is not a grunge band. Okay, that Nirvana was not a grunge band. And let me just say this: I would definitely categorize Nevermind especially as not a grunge album. Okay, so definitely, if you were to ask me, is Nevermind a grunge album, I would say no, absolutely not. It might have the faintest hints of grunge, but as far as a band, as far as an album is concerned, it's not a grunge album. So first of all, we'd have to define what a grunge band is, what is grunge, and then we could ask the further question, does Nirvana fit the categories of grunge? And when you start defining any type of music, it's really difficult to define because there's a lot of factors that go into the development of a genre of music. It's not just one, it's not just two, it's normally several factors. And this is true of any type of music. Okay, this is true of any type of music, whether it's country, rock, rockabilly, whatever. It doesn't matter. Heavy metal, glam metal. You can't trace the origin of a band or of a genre of music down to one band or one point in time. It just doesn't work that way. So with that said, I'm going to give you a real simple rundown of the history of grunge. Real super simple though. Okay, so I know I'm going to be missing a lot of bands. I know that there are a lot of other factors. I'm going to give you two factors, and that is where grunge rock was developed, and then also Sub Pop records. And I think those two things are really the defining features of what grunge is. And then we can talk about whether or not Nirvana fits into that squarely or not. And yes, they do. And this is why I would definitely call Nirvana a grunge band overall. But there are certain aspects which we will get into, which I can't consider them to be a grunge band 100%. So music scene developed particularly between the mid 80s and the late 80s in the Northwest in a particularly unique music scene. Okay, it rains a lot there. Kids don't have a lot to do. So what do? They go inside and they play guitar. They make bands. They make music, and that was part of what a lot of teenagers did during that time. However, their music scene was to a degree isolated and only fed to them kind of by what was on TV, early MTV, what was coming over on the radio, and it gave them a really super unique flavor as far as their musical influences. Very few bands went up that direction. And so the music scene was really super local. So it's almost like, to put it in a negative sense, it's almost like what's the incest? Okay, it's almost like incest, where these people just kind of keep feeding off of each other, and there's not a lot of output from other places. However, the major rock bands didn't make it up that far. It just wasn't lucrative enough for them to go up into these small places and to spend time in even bigger places like Seattle. However, a few bands did. Now, what bands were they that kind of made it up to that area? Well, they were mostly independent bands, like Black Flag being probably the chief example. Why were independent bands going up there more than big label bands? Well, because if you are an independent band on kind of this, maybe a small label or even a big label's taking a chance on you, you're going to take gigs wherever you can get them. Okay, that's all there is to it. You're going to take gigs wherever you can get them, and so you might end up going to some far obscure place to play and make no money at all, but you might get a free meal out of it. You might get a couple other perks for being in a band out of it that are not so, I don't know, savory, I should say. And you do that because you're in a band, because you love the music and you just want to get the word out about your music. So the Northeast was a hot spot for that. Also at that time in 1986, you had Sub Pop Records come out, and Sub Pop Records started collecting these bands, and they really started out kind of as this independent label collecting these bands, and these bands all started to sound kind of the same because of aforementioned ideas that I already talked about. So because these bands all started to sound the same, they became grunge. Now, again, and one of the reasons that it's called grunge is because these aren't professionals. Okay, even when Sub Pop started, they're far from professionals, and because they're not professionals, they sound a little dirty. They sound raw. They sound not refined. Okay, so that's why that term grunge came out. It was this idea that these bands just did not sound clean, they didn't sound well engineered, and they didn't sound professional. Okay, and because they didn't sound professional, they just had this raw kind of edge to them, and they had this mix of musical influences that you just kind of, you listen to the bands that you could listen to, anything that was rebellious, anything that was rock and roll. And these bands started to emerge, and Sub Pop started to collect these bands and send them out on the road and do their tape of the month thing, their singles club that they had, where they would send you singles if you signed up. So these bands started all sounding the same, and that started to sound like grunge. Now, Nirvana was one of these bands. And of course, I would say that if there's any album that Nirvana did that could squarely be put into the grunge category, it would have been their first album, and that's Bleach. Bleach is certainly, without a doubt, one of the most grunge sounding albums that there are. But like About a Girl is an exception to that. And the reason why is that Nirvana had some influences during that time that particularly Kurt Cobain listened to, that bled into their music, that radically changed from what they did on Bleach to what they did on Nevermind. So, for example, he was really into the Beatles, which a lot of people at that time weren't into the Beatles. People, if you were listening to old music, it was more the Doors than the Beatles. But he liked that pop sound, particularly John Lennon. He also listened to bands like The Knack and the Bay City Rollers. As a matter of fact, he said that his band is an amalgamation of the Bay City Rollers and The Knack and Black Flag and Black Sabbath. So he had this pop sensibility to him, and that pop sensibility and that clean sound really came out in Nevermind. Now, I will say that the way that Nirvana is a grunge band is, number one, the way they look. The way they look was a result of their influence from where they lived. Everybody dressed like lumberjackers because everybody there was a lumberjacker. Okay, that was a big, huge industry, and it was cold, and so you wore flannel and you wore long johns and you wore long johns under, and nobody was up there, playing music with leather pants on or a cut up jeans or a shirt that was designer, with a studded bracelet or big hair. They couldn't afford that. And so there was a real connection between what you wore every day and you're not going to get cleaned up and wear your leather pants up for a show. That's just not all there was to it. And Nirvana certainly fit that category. They looked like everybody else because that's just what everybody else looked like during that time and during that era, not that era, but that location. That's just what you look like. And then the other thing that Nirvana had going for it that did put them into grunge was the raw edgedness of their music, which even does carry over into Nevermind to some degree. However, the way that they are not a grunge band, and this is why I would have argued that they're not a grunge band, is that if you listen to grunge, if you listen to all these bands, Nirvana sounds distinctly different than all these bands that kind of got picked up during that era and became popular during that era, whether it's sub pop or not. Okay. So if you listen to grunge bands, if you listen to Alice in Chains, if you listen to Pearl Jam, if you listen to L7, if you listen to Screaming Trees, if you listen to Tad, even if you listen to like Mudhoney's and something like that, Nirvana sounds very different than all those bands. How do they sound different? How did they sound different than all those bands? Now, as I said before, the earliest album didn't sound too different from those bands, but certainly Nevermind sounded different, and certainly Incesticide sounded really different as well. How did they sound different? What was it that made them sound different? Well, they were much more punk rock influenced. As a matter of fact, for me, when I listen to Incesticide and when I listen to Nevermind, and even to a degree when I listen to In Utero, I really feel like I'm listening to a punk band with a grunge attitude or with an unrefined grunge edge to it, and a little bit more pop. To me, they sounded more like a dirty version of the Pixies than they sounded like Alice in Chains or Tad. They did not sound like that. Alice in Chains, Soundgarden, and Pearl Jam sound more similar to each other than Nirvana sounds to those bands. You picking up what I'm laying down? You understand what I'm saying? I just think that Nirvana was in a category all its own. Now, again, their first album certainly was grunge. The way they looked certainly was grunge. Their rough edge certainly was grunge. However, that really, to me, that was about it. They had more in common. They sounded to me more like the Pixies and more like Jesus and the Mary Chain than they sounded like those other bands. Those other bands all kind of sounded similar. They kind of had a lower register. They had the Jarl kind of thing going on. And even the other pop bands that weren't as popular sounded kind of the same. The only band out of that era and out of that area that kind of came out that I feel like Nirvana sounded like the most was Mudhoney. If you listen to Mudhoney sounds like, and Mudhoney's a great band, don't misunderstand me, but Nirvana sounds like a better version of Mudhoney. And if you know the history, I know that's going to piss a lot of people off by me saying that, but if you know the history, Mudhoney was a bigger influence on Nirvana than any of these other bands like Tad or L7 or Screaming Trees or anything like that. I just feel like they had a different sound. So that's my argumentation as to why Nirvana is a different kind of band and could not necessarily be considered a grunge band. At least it can't. They're not grunge in the same way that, say, Alice in Chains is grunge. They're just not. They're not grunge in the same way that Soundgarden is grunge. They're not grunge in the same way that a Pearl Jam is grunge, or Tad, or Screaming Trees. They just have a unique sound. They are much more, in my mind, aligned to, as I already said, something like a filthier, heavier version of the Violent Femmes than they do sound like any of those other bands that came out during that time. So that would be my argumentation as to why I wouldn't consider them to be at least 100% a grunge band. So what do you think? Do you think they're a grunge band? Do you think I'm crazy in my evaluation? Now, I have to say that I'm really sorry. At the beginning of this, it was a little bit more messy than it is right now. My second live, where I'm actually just going live. But let me just encourage you, please write a comment below if you've heard me out and you've heard my argumentations as to why I don't think that they are at least 100% completely grunge. Am I up in the night on my argumentations? Or would you agree with me that you would also not consider Nirvana to be a grunge band? Leave it in the comment section below. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell notification, and what else? Oh, just subscribe and share this around. It means a lot to me. Take care, and we will talk to you again real soon.